Thank you to you all for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. I'm now going to introduce them to you in the order that they'll be speaking, and I think you'll see that we've got a really interesting range here. First of all, we've got Elen Phillips, who's speaking to us as Principal Curator of Contemporary and Community History at St Fagan's National Museum in Cardiff, where she's co-lead of the Collecting COVID Wales 2020 project. I also noticed that her research interests include participatory curatorial practice, which seems very relevant, and she's also written about museum activism. We'll then be hearing from Carolin Roeder, who's a historian and currently visiting postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She's co-lead of The Mask, a RAID project, which explores the material, technological and cultural aspects of the face mask, the most iconic artifact of COVID-19 crisis. I think we'll all agree. Cara will be talking next. She's a sociology PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a quantitative survey committee co-lead for the AAPI COVID-19 project, which examines the ongoing COVID-19 crisis as it shapes the lives of Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders in the United States. That sounds really important, Cara. We're hoping to hear about that. And finally, Dominika Moravčíková is a postgraduate researcher in the Institute of Musicology at Charles University Prague, and she's working on a project examining public and private sound regimes during the pandemic. That sounds absolutely fascinating, Dominika. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. So I'd like to kick off straight away now with you, Elen.
Okay, I'm going to just try to share my screen. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Yeah, great, thank you. Well, thank you for the welcome and for this opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing here at St Fagan's National Museum of History in Wales. As you've heard, I'm Elen and I'm co-leading the museum's Collecting COVID initiative with my colleague Mark Etheridge. I'm hoping that Mark is somewhere in this Zoom call because all being well, he's going to try and share some links in the Q&A or the chat to some of the resources I'll be mentioning during my presentation. Just to say as well, obviously this is ongoing work, so this is very much a case study about the delivery phase of the project. And although it was called Collecting COVID Wales 2020, I think it now should be Wales 2021 as well. I think we thought that we'd be in more of a post-COVID world by now, but we're not, unfortunately. So let's roll back to March 2020, when it became increasingly obvious to everyone in the museum sector globally that we were about to embark on a public history collecting project like no other in recent times. At St Fagan's, we took a good few weeks to absorb what was happening, to get to grips with the enormity of the situation, both as museum professionals, but also as, as human beings with our own concerns, worries, and emotions. But it did seem, through the tail end of March and into April, that a day did not go by without a museum somewhere launching a rapid response collecting project. And these are some of the headlines and blog headlines from those early weeks. So museums scramble to document the pandemic even as it unfolds. You can kind of feel the urgency in these words from the New York Times there. But at St Fagan's, we were very aware that we had a national responsibility to collect the pandemic. So we needed to design a project which reflected our values and established ways of working. That is, to be an outlet for people to tell their own stories in their own words. So the challenge for us was to devise an initiative which responded to the emotional needs of people in the present, while also taking into account the long-term legacy and the impact of our collecting work in the future. And of course, on a practical level, we had to work within lockdown conditions, which inevitably led to an emphasis on digital collecting. So what did we do? Well, we took inspiration from a collecting methodology which is rooted in the museum's past, the humble questionnaire. So between 1937 and the early 80s, the museum would routinely issue questionnaires and blank answer books asking for information on a range of subject areas, from cooking practices to agricultural calendars and ways of life. And these were printed on paper and then sent out to respondents across Wales. And we have about 800 of these replies in our archive, spanning roughly around 50 years. So although they provide a rich source of data, there is an undeniable rural bias in their geographical reach. And these questionnaires favoured processes and technical detail over feelings and attitudes. So although these old questionnaires provided an intellectual framework for us, with the Collecting COVID questionnaire, we wanted to allow space for people to reflect on their emotions, frustrations, and aspirations, should they wish to, as well as, of course, documenting their new daily COVID routines and rituals. So on the 15th of May 2020, the Collecting COVID questionnaire, it's bilingual, Welsh and English, was launched on the museum's website. So we're now talking 2 months into the lockdown here in Wales. The questionnaire had 22 questions, so it's quite a hefty undertaking, covering 4 areas: daily life, health and well-being, government and information, and I'm not sure if you can see it at the end here, but a section called the future. So the last section was an attempt to get people to start thinking historically about their experiences. And in this section as well, we asked people to identify objects that they may be willing to donate to the museum in the future. So it ran from May until October, and we received 1,019 replies. We were kind of aiming for a data set of around 300. So we were completely, humbled and floored by the response. And people have been very, very honest and candid in their submissions. And I think this does show, in my opinion, the importance and the value of collecting personal testimony in the moment. There's no distance of time here to cloud people's judgment, to foggy the brain, to reminisce and to, start to romanticize perhaps about their experiences in the past. Obviously, those taking part have written their submissions knowingly, so they were aware of our intentions as a museum to possibly share and publish their words. So there must be some filtering going on as they're writing their replies. But on a whole, what we have is very honest and brutal. People wanted and want their experiences to be heard. And I guess having your story in the National Archive of your country is a form of validation. This happened to me and my story matters. So we're yet to fully analyse the entire data set, but I've pulled out some quotations on the screen for you here to get a flavour. You can also read a selection of personal stories on our website. All in all, the responses really do reflect how this pandemic has compounded social and economic inequalities. So top centre here, you have a vicar talking about a food distribution project within his parish. And he says, some of the calls I take as a vicar are particularly tough at the moment. People grieving, people struggling with mental health, people who are in desperate poverty, and people who can't cook anything with the food we give them because the poverty is so diverse and vast. This can be difficult to comprehend at times. Bottom left there, this past week I feel anxious, easily annoyed, like all this feels too impossible. The Dominic Cummings scandal, the death of George Floyd have left me with what can only be described as blind rage. I feel furious. I feel unable to process this or move on without being able to discuss things with people face to face. I think there's also a sense there in some of the responses that they needed an outlet for their feelings and experiences, and that taking part had well-being benefits for them. So in the middle there at the bottom, this questionnaire has been surprisingly therapeutic. I feel strangely lighter, like I've just spent half an hour in the confessional. And on the right there, two people reflecting on the idea of living through history, which is a term or a phrase that we hear so often these days. My son is very excited to be sharing these pictures with you to represent our lockdown. He is excited that he is making history and children will learn about this time for many generations to come. And then bottom left there, I think the initial shock of the early days of lockdown will be most indelible in my mind. I remember thinking, this is history, but history normally only happens to past generations, not us. So together with the 1019 written submissions, we've also received 160 digital images. And again, these are all available on the museum's website. And as I mentioned earlier, we're now following up with these offers of objects. So the material culture of the pandemic, and face masks will become a part of this collection, I'm sure. So far, we've collected around 61 objects, ranging from craftwork made in lockdown to PPE and medical supplies. Like bottom left there, that's a COVID testing kit. So we think of collecting very much in a holistic way, the written testimony and the oral testimony together with images and the material culture. So there you have your pod, your display, if you like, in a gallery context. So what next? Well, we're planning a second questionnaire to be launched in May, 12 months on from the first, with the intention here of trying to capture how people's feelings may have changed over time. But now we envisage that the digital survey approach, the questionnaire, will become a key component of the museum's contemporary collecting strategy going forward. So that's where we're at here in Wales.
Thank you ever so much, Ellen. With no further ado, let's head on to Carolin while I get my telephone. Thank you.
Would you like me to start or? Yes, okay, hello. Thanks so much for having me. It's very exciting to be here, wherever that here is these days, right, in the virtual world. And I am going to share my screen with you right now. Here we go. So I am the founder and co-leader of a project called The Masquerade, and I thought instead of a PowerPoint and go right to the website, that is the heart of the project. And so the Masquerade project is a interdisciplinary collaborative essay project, and it brings together historian of science, but also historian of the environment and other realms together with artists to think about the face mask and its different layers of meaning, both in a cultural and also material way. And I would briefly talk about how the project came about, and then about the interdisciplinary character of the project, and lastly, a few words on the insights on benefits of the project being of a global reach. So the project was really born in I think the first Zoom departmental meeting we had. So I'm part of the department Artifacts, Action and Knowledge, and you already hear the material aspect of the department in the title. And it was a first meeting where we had no idea how work will work in future, how the future of the world will be and so on. So we're just like checking in how we're all doing. And that was back in March 2020. And somehow it dawned on me that the face mask everyone was talking about really combines all intellectual interest people in the department have, people working on very different topics. So it combined questions of fabrics and fibers we had people working on, of the environment, of the more classical questions historians of science ask, of like knowledge and verification, of standardization. So lots of these questions were really tied up in this artifact. So I thought, let's do a project on it. And there it started, right, in that departmental, get together. And from the very beginning, we wanted to add a visual component to the project. And a fellow colleague put us in touch with a Berlin-based artist, Regina Maria Möller. And Regina has a label called Embodiment, where she, among others, produces artwork that relates to clothing. And her conceptual approach to materials, in particular textiles, just made her the perfect fit for this project. And she was also Berlin-based and a wonderful person to work with. So she sort of became one with the spirit of our project. So Regina created this collage that takes the visitor right into the project. And this collage is more than a visualization. It also speaks of our approach to think about the layered history of face mask, about different kinds of face mask that relate to each other sometimes and sometimes don't. And it also visualizes questions of hiding and of revealing and of shifting shapes of masks. So Regina is not the only artist who contributed to the project. Talking about layering, we layered art and history in various ways. For example, I'm scrolling down, we feature an interview with a Vietnamese artist, Tran Tuan, who already before the COVID crisis in 2016 used the face mask in an interactive art project that protested environmental degradation in Vietnam. We have a historian, Rita Brara, who uses the illustrations of an Indian artist to reflect about mask wearing and materials and class in India. And we also even feature a DIY artistic project that is also authored by Regina, where you can make your own little mask first aid kit and make your own mask out of a piece of paper. And of course, it's just more indicative of the DIY character, the material that people started using. So there are these like different ways how we involved artists, and it's more than just, oh, we need someone to illustrate or to visualize something. So it was really an interactive approach. So what were the insights of that collaboration for historians? So first of all, we realized how the creative process of writing and thinking becomes more dynamic. And thinking about concepts, how we want to approach as a team, the mask, it really helps to talk to artists because you think through the concepts and think, does it actually make sense when we visualize it? Can we communicate it to the public, or is it just fluff? So that was really helpful. Secondly, it also enabled us to have a communication strategy that was very successful and clearly more successful than just a text-based project would be. So the, let's say, visually appealing side of it and the interesting entryway really helped also our project to gain track. It's also really fun. That's a third insight. It's fantastic to work with different kind of artists and think about how, you know, questions historians ask touch upon artistic work. And it also leads to further projects. So we were contacted by the exhibition producers of the Berlin Science Year that will take place this year. And that project will become part of an outdoor exhibition on larger questions of health in front of the Berlin City Hall in the summer. And as we do have an artist involved in the project, there are new ways also to think about material representation of historical questions. So that is quite exciting. In terms of global breadth, so we have currently 11 stories and essays featured, and over half of them engage with East Asia and Southeast Asia. And from the very beginning, it was important for us, and that also reflects the interest of the department, to first of all approach the global pandemic as a global issue, but in particular address that the stereotypes that were emerging of the face mask wearing Asians. And so we do feature stories that really complicate for the Western reader, you know, the different historical approaches within the large space that is Asia to face mask We have a conversation between a historian of Japan and a historian of South Korea who interact with each other. We have a historian of Japan based in Canterbury asking back, so how about we ask why in the West face masks were not as prominent before the pandemic. And as I said, we also feature an essay about masks in India. So that was very important for us. And in fact, now we would love to have more submissions on face mask in North America and Europe. I think it's a very good problem to have. Quite often it's the other way around. And that having said, we are open for more submissions, either people who already have a topic on masks. We would also happily invite of the panelists to present their project with a short essay and link it. I think we would have like wonderful, intersections. And you find our contact details on the website. That is themasquerade.net. And I'm happy to speak to anyone who would be interested in contributing. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolin. That's a lovely offer. And what an interesting contrast between the two papers. Elen's looking at the kind of local experience and yours on this more global image. Cara, it'd be lovely to hear from you now.
Let's see. Can everyone see the presentation? Okay, great. So let's get set up. Thank you, Rochelle, Dr. Diamond, and Cardiff for organizing this online roundtable and your interest in the AAPI COVID-19 project. And thank you, Elen, Dr. Roeder, and Dominika for your research. I can definitely see some ties to my own research. I know Dr. Roeder, my co-author, and I are working on a face mask related manuscript right now. So we'll definitely be looking at your website. So AAPI stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander, and our research focuses on these communities in the United States. My name is Takasaki, mentioned earlier. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. In March of 2020, Dr. Vivian Shaw, she's our team leader, brought together a team of Asian American studies scholars who had community organizing backgrounds and a passion for communicating academic research to audiences outside of academia. Our research has benefited from the guidance and support of sociology professor Jason Beckfield at Harvard University, funding from the University of Colorado Boulder's Natural Hazards Center Quick Response Awards, very long title, and the Social Science Research Council's Just Tech COVID-19 Rapid Response Grant. So my involvement with COVID-19 research and anti-Asian racism began with the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center, founded by Professor Russell Jung and directors Manjusha Kulkarni and Cynthia Choi. From February through April of 2020, I worked with Professor Jung to quantify the rise of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia by first searching for international news reports and then quickly pivoting to US-based reports for advocacy purposes. The co-founders of the reporting center were working to establish a center that would collect counts of incidents of anti-Asian racism. They wanted to document the extent and quality of the incidents in the US because advocates wanted politicians, local leaders, government social services, law enforcement, and nonprofit organizations to be both apprised, prepared, and responsive to the rapid increase of anti-Asian racist incidents and their effect on AAPI communities. So last October, I published an article in the Journal of Asian American Studies. They had a special issue on COVID-19 about how collective leadership and community advocacy shaped the founding and early impact of the reporting center, if you wanted to learn more about some of the data that the reporting center had collected. So most Americans learn very little and selective pieces of Asian American and even less Pacific Islander history in school. While most Asian Americans, especially those with East Asian physical traits, so sort of thinking of Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Asian ancestry, they grew up navigating the model minority stereotype, which I can talk more about if that's of interest to people. They don't grow up learning about Asian American activism, social movements, political organizing, and resistance to racism. It's a sort of a selective history that, you know, based on nationalism and what the US wants students to learn. So what we see in our interview data is how the Black Lives Matter protests and racialization and politicization of COVID-19 in the US, particularly by the previous president's administration when he referred to the virus as Kung flu or China virus, have motivated many of our interview respondents to reflect on their racial and ethnic identities anew, to start community organizing and learning from online communities and spaces that popped up to be spaces of solidarity against racism and xenophobia. So our team members, Rachel Kuo, Amy Zhang, Vivian Shaw, and Cynthia Wang, published in Social Media and Society an article about media-based organizing. They analyzed the Asian American feminist collective zine Care in the Time of Coronavirus and the related tweet chat feminist antibodies. Along with this motivation that we hear from our interview respondents to better understand how race and racism shape AAPI lives, we also hear their uncertainty about their racial visibility and invisibility in the US. So referring back to Claire Jean Kim's theory of racial triangulation, and from other things I can talk about if people are interested, and from historical research on Asian Americans after the Cold War, like Ellen Wu's book, The Color of Success, we know that Asian Americans are often used as a homogenous racial group to justify oppression of other racial minorities, particularly Black Americans. Even though Asian Americans themselves only have access to partial belonging in the nation, as long as they perpetuate the model minority stereotype and seek to assimilate to white and heteronormative culture. In Immigrant Acts, Lisa Lowe explains how culture reveals the racial inequities of economic and political promises under democracy. So scholars of Asian America have referred to this partial belonging as being a forever foreigner. Given this history of AAPI communities in the US, our research tries to understand how the pandemic shapes the work and family lives of AAPI communities. Our study asks the following questions: how have racial, economic, and health risks, including racial stigma, social distancing, and financial precarity, impacted the labor practices of AAPI businesses and workers? How have experiences of working or not working during the pandemic affected their relationships and networks? And how do AAPIs working in different fields experience and make decisions around safety, risk, and instability? Over 2 years, we're conducting in-depth interviews with 200 AAPIs in both formal and informal economies. So this includes small business owners, self-employed and freelance workers, gig economy workers, sex workers and artists, care workers, hourly essential workers, salaried workers, and salaried workers. We're also doing 2 20-minute surveys. One is on caregiving and another is on paid labor. We're surveying 500 respondents, 250 AAPI self-identified and 250 non, which I think is an important contribution because we can compare answers across measures to see how the pandemic is affecting both AAPIs and non-AAPIs. And our third data strand includes digital ethnography and focus groups with Asian migrant workers in informal economies. This is to gauge the pandemic's impacts on progressive AAPI worker-led movements, and we're partnering with a New York City-based grassroots organization. So because many Asian Americans work in the service industry as entrepreneurs, contractors, and they own small businesses, or they work in healthcare, this is due to the history of the way Asian immigration policy has incorporated Asian Americans into the US, particularly in recent waves. The longitudinal design of the project recognizes the evolving nature of the pandemic and how it has the potential to profoundly alter respondents' social relationships, working conditions, financial circumstances, and health over time. So some of our findings show that interviews with AAPI respondents in precarious industries suggest that economic relief policies should include support for underemployed workers. For example, restaurant workers describe a double bind where decreased patronage because of xenophobia triggers cuts in paid working hours, but they remain ineligible for unemployment benefits. And it's hard to make more predictions about the policy's impact because of the transition that's happening in federal government, where the federal government is trying to figure out what's happening. But there are several pieces of legislation that address relief for COVID-19, as well as legislation targeting racist harassment and hate crimes. So for example, the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center that I mentioned earlier in the talk, reported that since last spring, there have been more than 2,500 self-reported cases of anti-Asian hate incidents. Recently, President Biden signed an executive action condemning xenophobic language to refer to the pandemic and called on the Justice Department to collect data on hate crimes and harassment that AAPI communities are facing. So during the discussion, I'd be happy to talk more about findings from our research, the research design of our study, findings from the Reporting Center, or the history of Asian American racism in the US. Thank you. Oh, and I meant to show these, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cara. That looks like really interesting and important work. I'm sure we'll want to come back and hear about the findings, but first let's hear from Dominika, please, in the last of our presentations today.
Sorry. Okay, here it is. Okay, thank you for inviting me to take part in this timely discussion. I'm hoping to add some value. So in my presentation, I want to briefly discuss my current research project focused on the oral experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically in its divide into public and private territories. For reasons of coherence of this short presentation, instead of going into details of methodology and the scope of this research, which I can talk about later, I want to rather address the aspect of social responsibility that comes with researching sound, especially during these times. So my research project started as a non-academic essay in the special issue of Slovak magazine Capital in May 2012, reflecting the fresh experience of national lockdowns in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The idea for this research topic was sparked by sonic changes in my own private environment. During the first lockdown period in spring 2012, the neighboring apartment room behind my wall, a room which I never saw but was aware of thanks to its sounds, was suddenly no longer a kid's room, but an adult's new home office. The soundscape of children's games was replaced by a soundscape of business phone calls. This essay was titled Radical Listening in the Quarantine City, and after publishing it, I realized that I should elaborate my ideas further as the experience of navigating the pandemic times continued and grew in complexity. In his study Acoustic Relations, Brandon Labelle states, quote, "Sound is intrinsically and unignorably relational. It occurs among bodies, it pushes against architecture, it escapes rooms, vibrates walls, disrupts conversations. Sound is never a private affair, but always already a public event, in that it moves from a single source and immediately arrives at multiple destinations," end quote. This relational nature of sound creates multiple challenges in conceptualizing the pandemic oral experience along the lines of its public and private divide. The relationality of sound also parallels the limits of privacy as a realm outside the social and political, since the very possibility of privacy is unequally distributed among peoples, and therefore privacy is always confined to and restricted by politics. Now moving to the discourse of silence. In the early public discourse around sound during the pandemic, one of the most prevalent features of national lockdowns was the excitement over slowed down traffic and radical reduction of industrial sounds. Although this appreciation is understandable, there are inherent problems tied to the celebration of silence as a sensoric gain. As Elsa Lipscomb argues in her ethnomusicological exploration of hospital sound ecologies, quote, "Designating sound as quote-unquote bad and silence as quote-unquote good falsely presumes a universal way of hearing that ignores bodily difference and unique histories of listening," end quote. Another problematic aspect comes from the fact that in some cases, silence and also acoustic privacy might be socially inaccessible. For some communities in Slovakia, it was not silence, but amplified noise and loss of privacy that defined the quarantine regime. sound regime. This was the case for the residents of the Romani village near town Žehra. In April 2012, after dozens of COVID cases were confirmed in the community, the government imposed a blanket quarantine on the whole Romani village and enforced it by a full-time military presence around the quarantine zone. For the residents of Žehra, the defining oral features of spring 2012 was the soundscape of military surveillance, including military vehicles and helicopter noise. Žehra was not the only case. In April of 2012, overall 6,000 people in 5 Roma villages were quarantined. The term quarantine village has been coined in Slovak media, referring specifically to the militarized quarantines of Roma settlements. The language of the media also centered disciplination as a possibly positive instrument of education, as if quarantine was a lesson to be learned. This notion could be seen, for example, in this headline, which also interestingly provides an ambivalent oral characteristic of the place, quote, "Loud music and dance, but also fear. Roma people are learning to live in mandatory quarantine." The phenomenon of quarantine villages reveals the prevalence and nature of the racial divide in Slovakia. As Jakub Cehav writes, quote, "In crude words, the attitude is that in normal times we might engage in social and political experiments with Roma inclusion, but in moments like these, such projects should be put on hold and we must turn to militarization of their communities to protect the greater good of the nation." So in the particular case of my research, I feel the need and responsibility to emphasize sonic privacy as a social privilege and also appreciate the diversity of altered sonic experiences and practices in the time of lockdowns. As anthropologist Lisa Abulabgot argues, quote, "Generalization, the characteristic mode of operation and style of writing of the social sciences can no longer be regarded as neutral description," end quote. To conclude, our studies and mappings of acoustic territories and practices during the pandemic should critique and ultimately break the appearance of homogeneity, and our strategies of collecting and curating data should include ones of avoiding colonization of particular voices, bodies, places, and imaginations. In the process of creating sonic histories of the COVID-19 pandemic, we must discard ethnocentric and also anthropocentric views and work towards situated knowledge and an inclusive, diverse, and uncolonial archive, one that would include sonic memories of not only home office urban dwellers, but also of people like the residents of Žehra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominika. That's really eye-opening for us to learn about what you've just presented. So thank you to all our speakers. You've kept to time brilliantly, and we've got really 20 minutes for discussion now. So I'd like to encourage our attendees to put up their questions on the Q&A or to indicate if they'd like to raise their hand if they'd like to ask a question. I can see that Jonathan Hopkinson has asked a question for Dominika. Would you like to ask that, Jonathan? No. No, well, maybe I could ask on your behalf then. Jonathan asks, how have you seen musical innovations develop during the pandemic, both in visible and audio formats?
Yeah, so there are many councils projects of online collaboration of musicians that are just interacting online together. And the silver lining of these times is that everything is more or less archived records. So we have like endless archive of these Zoom meetings and so on. And yeah, I think this really is a time of where new cultural forms are being developed, and we can like see it in the observe it live, and later hopefully we will be able to reflect on it in more in ways that also will be able to like interpret it and like curate this sort of endless archive of current improvising and interacting musically online.
Thank you, Dominika.
Sorry, just to jump in there, Hannah, I realised Jonathan did raise his hand in the end, and I just didn't let him speak there. As host, we have to allow him to speak, but that was my bad.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realise either. Well, Claire Guerrero is asking a question. Perhaps we can release her to speak.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great. I put a question in the chat, colleagues, around food cultures. One of the things that I've really noted from COVID-19 is on social media, and I put myself in this category, the obsession with food cultures. And I do think food has actually been one very prevalent way that people have both sustained themselves, sort of psychologically, and also presented a creativity in lockdown. I do wonder, and it's my question to all of your colleagues here, how do you curate food culture? Because I really think that's a prevalent part of lockdown.
Would you like to take that in order? I don't know, Ellen, do you have a thought?
Yeah, well, just to say that we asked a specific question in our questionnaire about food practices and food shopping. And although we anticipated that food would come under the daily life section, it actually permeates every single response to every part of the questionnaire, from the emotions around food, anxiety about food and shopping, to food being a source of comfort and well-being. So it's through all the responses in every 22 questions is a reference to food. We have started, well, we do have a curator at the museum who is responsible for collecting food culture, domestic life and so on. But we are collecting people's recipes, and we've got images of people making bread, sourdough, and the usual cake baking with families at home and so on. And we're also now starting to collect around the Facebook groups that formed around food during the pandemic. So going forward, I think it will be a very strong theme in the collection, in the COVID-19 collection here at the museum.
Do any of the others, do you have thoughts about food, Carolin?
I just had this idea that it would be brilliant actually to have an essay on the kind of baking face masks. So at my local bakery here, you can buy, actually several ones in Berlin, you can buy cookies with face mask on. So like either just a face mask cookie, there was a toilet paper roll cake. So the material culture of the face mask, like even that relates back to food. So I would just look for a volunteer writer or actually also collections of images of food that visualizes the face mask again. So I'm happy to collect.
Yeah. Thank you. Cara, has food been part of the work you've been doing?
Yes, for sure, in multiple ways. One is because of the exoticization of Asian American food, there's economic impacts, obviously, for, like I mentioned, the economic incorporation of Asians in the US, where many own ethnic-based businesses, particularly restaurants or groceries. So there's that part of it. There's also, so in terms of, I'm not sure if it's about curation, but in terms of the other part of our findings would be that food being something that everybody needs to eat, even during a pandemic. So even when there was a lockdown in the US and people, weren't allowed to really be interacting, some of the places where we were seeing all of the upticks in anti-Asian racism was happening at the places where people could still go, which was essentially like markets, groceries, big box retailers. And there were interesting answers from our interview respondents, because some of them would be considered essential workers because they work in these areas, right, in service industry. And on one hand, they're worried about their own health, right, because of people coming in not wearing masks, right, because the US has a lot of politicization going on, where you can imagine, like in Texas, like people just don't want to wear masks. And so And so you have these workers who have to come in to like support themselves. So they need to be careful, but they have to interact with these, these customers who aren't following protocol. At the same time, they're also, in what we're finding, more scared about the racism than their health risk. So both being seen as Asian, so wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, I'm worried about my own security, my own like autonomy and health. And then even before that, we have multi-generational families, and a lot of them live together. So a lot of our respondents talking about worried for their parents because they need food, but their parents, putting off grocery store shopping to like the very last moment because they're, afraid of the racism they'll face, particularly because of, also having accents and whatnot. And so a lot of respondents changing either like where they live or having to go home, and at the same time also working in industries where they still have to interact with people. They can't work from home. So the give and take of I need to take care of my parents, but also I don't want to infect them because I need to still go to work and be a nurse or something. So yeah, tied to food, as in like food is necessary for everyone in a way that we all interact, and also food being a way that Asians have continued to be exoticized and face racism in the US.
Good, thank you for that. And Dominika, is this relevant to the work you're doing, food?
Yeah, I was thinking about kitchen sounds because when I surveyed some people and like their sonic experience of the pandemic, they said that they noticed changes in how they experience sounds in their apartment, and particularly in the kitchen, and not only cooking but also some random fridge noises or noises coming from various devices in the kitchen, and like got immersed in like these small things and small sounds inside their own apartment. So this might be also interesting.
That's a really good question. Thank you, Claire, for that. Now I see that Jonathan has got a question for Ellen. Maybe we can release him to speak this time, Sam. Shall we see? And he can ask his own question.
Should be able to speak now.
Okay. Ellen, I live across the border in North Herefordshire, and I'm interested in whether there's any parallel project, community project in England, or if there isn't, whether you could share your questionnaire so we could do something on a very local scale.
Yeah, happy to share with you the questions that we asked. I think we've taken down the questionnaire off our website because we closed the questionnaire on the 31st of October. But as I said, we will be having a second questionnaire this year. I think there are parallel projects in England. I'm not sure on a national scale, but certainly museums such as the Museum of the Home in London, formerly known as the Jeffrey Museum, they have a questionnaire or a similar kind of project where you upload your changing experiences of your home and the way you navigate your personal space within the home. So there are quite a few, I think, dotted around in various museums. So I'd be happy to send off some links to you after the session, and obviously share with you the full 22 questions that we asked.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you, Ellen. Now, Alexander White, would you like to ask your question to the whole panel, I think?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
You're all good.
Oh, fantastic. I'm afraid my internet connection isn't fantastic, but maybe that reinforces my my point in a weird way. So I'm interested in the ways that media has defined the experience of COVID-19 in the UK. I mean, I think it's been incredibly important, but I also think that media artifacts tend to be quite ephemeral. How do we account for unexpected silences and viral hits and news updates being leaked over Twitter, and how people gain information and experience? So I was wondering, how can we help to archive media artifacts and help future historians recreate what media has meant to us in the past couple of months?
do you have thoughts? Any of you? Ellen, do you have something you could say to that?
Well, in our questionnaire, we do ask about the media generally, but I think we were thinking about more traditional forms of media, news outlet, print media. We do ask people, where do you get your information from? But obviously lots of people have referenced things like the memes, the jokes, the WhatsApp messages, the group chats and so on. And they are very, very difficult to archive for all sorts of reasons, from a legal and copyright point of view to how do you actually physically archive, you know, a meme or a WhatsApp thread, and so on. I think as a museum, my museum now, St. Fagan's, that's something we really need to look into. I know there are people doing PhDs on how museums archive that ephemeral kind of snappy news and memes and so on. But whether or not we successfully do it here at St. Fagan's, I think we're a bit behind the curve on that one. But we have captured it in written format in the questionnaire. So people telling us about, you know, where they get their sources of information from during the pandemic.
Thank you, Ellen. I don't know, Cara, I wondered whether you might have something to say to that.
Sure, yeah. So it's been a really rich site, particularly, like as I mentioned, there's a strand of our research using digital ethnography, particularly to, and focus groups, but to learn more about informal migrants, because we can't maybe necessarily actually be there to do the ethnography. And then, so to learn about organizing and for example, with Asians in meat packing plants, sort of these tend to be, you know, more working class, face more English language barriers. It's difficult for these groups to advocate for themselves, and they're scared to as well because of the possibility of being undocumented or being deported. And so something that's great about being able to be online for a lot of their organizing is that we can, you know, be present or be able to access those kinds of data. As well as, I think we mentioned the activism that we all see online in terms of social movements, both tied to the Black Lives Matter movement, and to tie it back into Dr. Roeder's masks, there were, you know, a lot of hashtags about I'm not a virus, that then got printed onto masks that Asians would wear. But creating spaces for solidarity both within racial groups, but also across racial groups. So seeing even these webinars on, like, for example, there was one recently on Black Asian feminist solidarities. And so being able to open up these spaces to anyone, allowing people to, I think for a lot of the respondents that we've talked to, both facing the anti-Asian racism that came with the COVID pandemic in the US, but also then spurring them to actually try to find out more about Asian American history and the racism that has happened in the US, and then also to find spaces of solidarity has, I think, been really productive, and especially in relation to like Black Lives Matter protests. But yeah, so I think for us, the digital media is really rich source of information, and maybe the biggest challenge is kind of what Ellen was talking about, is like, how do we filter it? How do we, you know, pick the boundaries of the data collection, especially in spaces where things are just always changing, like a Google Doc, for example. At what point do you analyze it, right? Because it's changing all the time. But yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you, Cara. I think we might move on. We're running out of time, but if we could take Chris Hood, I would like to make a question, and hopefully we might have time for Patrick too. So Chris.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Thank you, panelists, for very interesting talks. I'm afraid my internet came and went a few times, but I think I grasped most of it, and I hope my question doesn't cover an area which someone's already covered. To some degree, it also follows on from the previous question, that I'm interested in the degree to which museums, but also researchers will be looking at media consumption, I guess, at one level during the pandemic. Organizations like Netflix in particular have done so well from people's streaming programs. So to what degree will people look at what was streamed and also then the knock-on effect of that? So people taking up chess because they were watching a particular program and things like this, but also the added thing of looking at how certain media and programs can deal with issues related to the pandemic without dealing with it directly. So this comes from the experience of my research looking at a plane crash in Japan, where a dramatization was done in 2012 because the TV series wanted to do something about the huge earthquake and tsunami in 2011, but thought it was too soon to do it. So they could deal with the same issues of bonds between family by actually dealing with a more historical event. And in relation to the COVID pandemic, that made me sort of think about the Channel 4 series, It's a Sin, which although it's dealing with a very different kind of illness and virus, watching the program, I couldn't help but draw parallels with the way that society and the government has responded to two different viruses. So I feel as though that there's maybe more that researchers and museums could do to draw links between responses to very different types of pandemics and problems.
That's quite a big question for us to cover in 1 minute. I'm not quite sure. Sam, what do you think? Do you think we can overrun a little bit?
It's up to Roselle, but I think we could probably do, yeah, if anyone's got any responses they'd like to field to that.
Ellen, do you have a thought or?
Sorry, can you recap the first part of the question? Was it about consumption of?
Yeah, so looking at not so much the memes and social media posts, that type of media related specifically to COVID, but where because people have been locked down and can't work, they start binging on series on Netflix or watching certain movies. I mean, during the first lockdown, any movie which had anything related to a virus seemed to get very popular. And then, of course, there are other TV series which also got popular. And some of these have then led on to people developing certain hobbies and interests related to these programs. So I just feel as though that's something that potentially could get missed unless museums and others are actually keeping an eye on it and are going to be tracking this.
Yeah, I mean, again, those small details of everyday life, they have been explored in the questionnaire, not explicitly, but we do ask people, have your hobbies changed during the pandemic? How has your daily routine changed? So we don't specifically ask so much about, TV consumption, what have you. They're quite broad, overarching questions where there's space there for people to meditate and reflect on, the intricacies of their new daily routines. I suppose for us, it's very difficult because we're a National History Museum. We've got a huge remit, and we found even with the questionnaire that we had, it had 22 questions, and it was actually asking quite a lot of people already, emotionally, from a time point of view. So with a second questionnaire, we might not actually cover so much ground. And just to kind of, while we're talking about the second questionnaire now, the first questionnaire was developed by curators in a hurry against the clock during the first lockdown. The second questionnaire, we will actually be developing those questions with community groups to make sure that we're asking the right questions. So in a way, the second questionnaire will be a way of evaluating the first one as well and tweaking the methodology. We've talked a lot about digital consumption. My worry, and I thought maybe the question would arise, of how are you going to connect with those people who are not online, who are digitally excluded? And that is a concern of mine, certainly. How do we reach people who are not savvy with the iPad, who can't access WhatsApp? So I think with the second questionnaire, we will be looking more carefully on working with agencies, grassroots organisations, and hoping that they can help people and turn the questionnaire into an activity with some of their service users, so people who may not have access to ICT equipment. So yeah, lots to consider for the second questionnaire, I feel, and certainly questions that need to be addressed that we didn't address first time round. So yes, we need to, I think, analyse and evaluate the first one a bit more before we launch the second.
Thank you, Ellen. These are all really interesting questions, but I think we may be out of time, Sam and Roussel. I see that Carolin is answering Patrick's question in the Q&A. So I think perhaps we do need to wind up, don't we?
Yeah, I think we do. We're scheduled for 1 hour, and there's so much more to ask and to discuss, but you've been so generous with your time so far. So we'll stop here. I'll just maybe just leave a little time so that Carolin can respond to that question that she is responding to. So if anyone has any final comments that they'd like to do while Carolin is typing in her comments.
I'm sorry, I don't know actually how to send. It doesn't send.
Oh, it's not sent.
It's not. There is no send button.
If you would like, you can paste it into the chat, maybe, for all panelists and attendees. I'll put the question in, and then maybe you can put your response if that's everyone's okay with that.
No, panelists. It's probably. I could have probably answered it. No, the question is more like I'm not sure. We will see.
Thank you, all of you. It's really raised so many interesting questions, and it's really helpful to know that you're all doing this wonderful work, so that when we finally get through this pandemic, we'll have a way of looking back. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just wanted to say thanks again to our speakers who've joined us at a very busy time, and we really do appreciate your contributions to the roundtable. Also, thank you to the attendees. Before we leave, I'd like to let you know about some upcoming events in the History and Heritage Research theme. On Wednesday, 10th March, Sam Young will be in conversation with Dr. Alistair Hemmings. They will be discussing the Paris Commune, as this year marks the 150th anniversary of its founding. And on Thursday, 29th April, we will be holding a book launch. The book is Silent Village by Robert Pike, who will be joining us as a postgraduate researcher later this year. His work provides an account of French life under the occupation, with a focus on the tragedy of Roeder-sur-Glane. I hope I pronounced that okay. All of the events will be on the School of Modern Languages events listing page and will be circulated on social media, so you can have a look at those. We will also be sending you a short survey after the webinar, and so you can also sign up for the mailing list there. So again, thank you very much, and goodbye. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.